Constantius' reactions to the death of Gallus. Using my best efforts to find out the truth, I have set out, in the order in which they occurred, events which I was able to observe myself, or discover through questioning of contemporaries who took part in them. The rest, which will occupy the pages that follow, I shall execute to the best of my ability in a more polished style, and I shall pay no heed to the criticism which some make of a work which they think too long. Brevity is only desirable when it cuts short tedious irrelevance, without subtracting from our knowledge of the past. Hardly had Gallus been stripped of his imperial dress in Noricum, when Apodemus, who was a firebrand all his life, snatched up the Caesar's shoes and, driving so hard with constant relays of horses that he destroyed some on the way, arrived first with the news at Milan. He threw the shoes down at Constantius' feet as if they were the spoils of a fallen Parthian king. At this sudden announcement that what had seemed so desperate and difficult a matter had been brought to a successful end with the utmost ease, the High Court officials, concentrating in a customary act of adulation their desire to stand well with the emperor, extolled to the skies the valour and good fortune of Constantius, at whose nod 2 princes, to wit, Vetranio and Gallus, had been cashiered, though at different times, like common soldiers. Constantius, intoxicated by this carefully compounded flattery, and firmly convinced that henceforth he would be immune from all of the ills that flesh is heir to, departed so far from the path of moderation as sometimes to use the words our eternity in dictating letters, and to style himself master of the world, when writing in his own hand. Such expressions, if they had been applied to him by others, should have aroused high indignation in a man who constantly declared that he was using his utmost endeavours to frame his life and character on the model of citizen emperors, even if he had been reigning over the innumerable worlds of Democritus, of which Anaxarchus encouraged Alexander the Great to dream. Reading or listening should have taught him to reflect that, according to the unanimous opinion of scholars, the circumference of the whole earth, which seemed to us immense, is no more than a tiny point in comparison with the vastness of the universe. Ursicinus and Julian accused of treason. Once the fallen Caesar had come to this miserable end, the trumpet rang out for a struggle in the courts of law, and Ursicinus was charged with treason. He was exposed increasingly to the jealousy which dogs all good men, and in particular he had to encounter the difficulty that the emperor was deaf to all reasonable and credible arguments for the defence, but lent a ready ear to the secret whispers of those who insinuated that the name of Constantius was forgotten throughout all the regions of the East, and that men were clamouring both in private and in public for the officer in question as the only commander who could put fear into the Persians. In the face of this the noble hero remained unshaken. He took care not to adopt too humble a posture, while he groaned inwardly that an innocent man could be placed in such danger. What particularly saddened him was that the friends who previously thronged about him had deserted to the stronger side, like the lictors who transferred their attendance from the holders of office to their successors when custom requires it. He had in addition to sustain the enmity of Arbitio, who was plotting against him under a cloak of goodwill, and who frequently referred to him openly as my gallant colleague. Arbitio was a past master in the art of entrapping a man of upright life in a fatal snare, and at that moment he enjoyed great power. He was like a snake which lies hidden in a hole in the ground, and watching for individual passers-by, whom it then suddenly attacks, even when he had attained high military command, he was consumed with jealousy of the prosperity of others, and sustained his conscience by his insatiable appetite for inflicting injury, though he himself had been neither injured nor even provoked. So after long deliberation with the emperor in the presence of a few accomplices, a decision was reached to carry off Ursicinus on the following night out of sight of the troops, and put him to death without a trial, a fate like that which we are told befell Domitius Calabrio, who had defended the provinces with loyalty and prudence during the vile times of Nero. This was arranged, and the agents appointed to carry out the plan were waiting for the hour to strike, when the emperor softened, and gave orders that the execution of this wicked deed should be deferred for further consideration. The engines of defamation were next turned against Julian, the famous future emperor, who had recently been fetched to Milan. His enemies asserted that he was guilty on 2 counts. First, that in pursuit of a liberal education he had left the estate of Marcellium in Cappadocia and made his way into the province of Asia, and second, that he had seen his brother Gallus when the latter was passing through Constantinople. Julian rebutted both charges and proved that in neither case had he acted without orders, but he would have perished at the hands of an abominable clique of toadies, had not the Empress Eusebia by some divine inspiration taken his part. He was escorted to Como, a town near Milan, and after a short stay there was allowed to go to Greece in accordance with his passionate desire to improve his mind. In the wake of these events some developments took place which might be ascribed to the operation of a favourable providence. Some punishments were justly inflicted, and in other cases the prosecution ran into the sand. But some rich men obtained the protection of those in power, and by clinging to them like ivy to high trees, brought themselves off at enormous expense, whereas poor men who had little or nothing with which to purchase their safety were condemned out of hand. So truth was overshadowed by lies, and in some cases falsehood passed for truth. At the same period, Gorgonius, who had been the Caesar's chamberlain, and who by his own confession had shared and sometimes prompted his outrages, got off scot-free, because the eunuchs combined to smother justice under a tissue of lies. Punishment of Gallus's adherents. While this was happening at Milan, parties of military personnel, together with a number of court functionaries, were brought from the east to Aquileia, drooping in their chains and almost at their last gasp. They cursed their continued existence under such a load of complicated misery. They were accused of being the agents of the savage tyranny of Gallus, responsible, it was believed, for Domitian and Montius being torn in pieces, and others subsequently driven over the brink of destruction. Arbitio, together with Eusebius, at that time chamberlain, was sent to try them. Both these were men of careless arrogance, equally capable of injustice and cruelty, without any thorough investigation, without drawing any distinction between innocent and guilty. They sentenced some to exile after being beaten or tortured, reduced others to the ranks, and condemned the rest to capital punishment. Then, having filled the cemeteries with corpses, they returned as if from a successful campaign, and reported their exploits to the emperor, who in these and similar cases never failed to show himself inflexible and severe. From this time onwards, Constantius, as if determined utterly to reverse what fate ordained, opened his mind more eagerly than ever to the intriguers who surrounded him. So there suddenly sprang up a host of rumour-mongers who attacked like wild beasts men at the summit of an honourable career, and afterwards, rich and poor indiscriminately, unlike the brothers from Sybera employed by Verres, who fawned upon the judgment seat of a single governor. These men spread mischief over the members of the whole state. Easily the most notorious among them were Paul and Mercury. the later a Persian by origin, the former a native of Dacia. Paul was a notary. Mercury had risen from attendance at the emperor's table to be a supervisor of his finances. Paul, as I said earlier, was known by the nickname of the Chain, because of his skill in linking slanders together to form an unbreakable whole. He spent his efforts in an astonishing variety of tricks, like some wrestlers who show superlative cleverness in their bouts in the ring. Mercury, on the other hand, was called the Count of Dreams. His speciality was to insinuate himself into dinner parties and similar gatherings, like a fierce dog who conceals its savage disposition by humbly wagging its tail. Then, if anyone mentioned to a friend that he had seen something in a dream, when nature roams unchecked, Mercury used his poisonous skill to paint it in the worst colours, and poured it into the receptive ear of the emperor, with the result that the person in question was treated as guilty of an unforgivable offence and subjected to a serious criminal charge. Such incidents were magnified by common rumour until at last, so far from publishing their dreams, people were reluctant to admit in the presence of strangers that they had slept at all, and some learned persons regretted that they had not been born in the region of Mount Atlas, where dreams are said to be unknown. But how that may be, we must leave to the experts in such matters. While judicial investigations and punishments were taking such dreadful forms, Illyricum was the scene of another calamity, which began with empty words and ended by bringing many people into danger. At a dinner given at Sirmium by Africanus, the governor of Lower Pannonia, some of the guests, believing that no one was there to betray them, spoke freely in their cups of their disgust at the existing regime. Others assured them that signs were not wanting that the change which they longed for was at hand, and some, with inconceivable folly, announced that it was foretold in prophecies handed down in their families. Among the party was a secret agent called Gaudentius, whose stupidity was equalled by his impetuosity. He reported the incident as a serious matter to Rufinus, at that time the head of the Praetorian prefect's staff, a man always eager for extreme measures and notorious for his inveterate badness of heart. Rufinus flew as if on wings to court, and informed the emperor, who was always accessible to suspicions of this kind, inflaming him to such a degree that without any pause for thought he gave orders for Africanus and all of his guests at the fatal meal to be taken up and carried off. This success encouraged the baleful informer, whose appetite, as is the way with men, was stronger for forbidden fruit, to ask for and obtain a prolongation of his existing office for 2 years. Teutomeres, a staff officer, was sent with a colleague to seize the offenders and brought them all in chains, in accordance with his orders. But when they reached Aquileia, the tribune Marinus, a former drill master, but at that time unattached, a man of fiery disposition, who had originated the fatal conversation, finding himself alone in an inn, while arrangements for the journeys were being made, plunged into his side a knife that lay to hand, disemboweled himself, and died on the spot. The rest were taken to Milan and tortured. They confessed that they had made some rash remarks at dinner, and were sentenced to imprisonment, though with some faint hope of eventual release. The officers, however, were condemned to exile on the grounds that they were privy to the suicide of Marinus, but were pardoned at the intercession of Arbitio. Campaign of Constantius against the Lentienses. When this affair was concluded, war was declared on the Lentienses and another Alemannic tribe on account of their frequent and widespread raids across the Roman frontier. The emperor set out on this campaign and reached the district of Raetia, called Campi Canini, where after long discussion it was decided that honour as well as expediency would be satisfied if Constantius remained there with part of the army, while the master of the horse, Arbitio, made his way with a stronger force along the shores of Lake Constance, ready to give immediate battle to the barbarians. I will describe the nature of the terrain as far as is consistent with my design. The Rhine, which rises with a prodigious head of water in the recesses of lofty mountains, makes its way without being joined by any tributaries over high cliffs, like the Nile pouring headlong down its cataracts. Its waters are so abundant that it would be navigable from its very source, were it not that it resembles a torrent rather than a stream. When it reaches level ground it runs between high banks till it enters the vast round lake of Constance, which the neighbouring Rhaetians call Brigantia. This is nearly 60 miles long and about the same in width. Access to it is barred by thick, rough forests, except where the disciplined valour of the old Romans has made a broad road in spite of the obstacles posed by barbarians, terrain, and climate. The river bursts into the lake in a loud welter of foam and passes through its calm and sluggish waters, as if they were an eternally hostile element, from which it is separated by a clear dividing line. Then, without augmentation or diminution of its original volume, it leaves the lake with name and strength unchanged, and without suffering any further contact merges at last with the waters of the ocean. What is particularly remarkable is that the lake is not disturbed by the rushing stream passing through it, nor the river impeded by the mud of the lake bottom, but the two bodies of water cannot mingle. If it were not for the evidence of one's own eyes, one would suppose that no power would suffice to keep them apart. In the same way, the Alpheus, which rises in Arcadia, cuts its way through the Ionian Sea, according to the myth, in the longing to reach the neighbourhood of its beloved fountain of Arthusia. Arbitio, though he knew the difficulties involved in opening a campaign, did not wait for the return of scouts sent to report the approach of the barbarians, but fell into an ambush and was brought to a halt by this sudden catastrophe. The enemy sprang upon him without warning and recklessly launched every kind of weapon at whatever target they could find. Resistance was impossible, and the only hope of escape lay in rapid flight. So our men, with no aim but to avoid being wounded, dispersed in all directions, and presented their backs to the foe. Most of them, however, who had scattered along narrow paths and escaped under cover of darkness, recovered their strength when day returned, and rejoined their units. In this melancholy and unexpected disaster, a large number of men and 10 tribunes were lost. On the following day, the Alemanni, encouraged by this success, advanced more boldly upon the Roman entrenchments. The light was veiled in morning mist as they ran hither and thither with drawn swords, grinding their teeth, and shouting boastful threats. Suddenly the Scutari made a sally, and, finding themselves repulsed and brought to a standstill by the opposing hordes, called with one voice on their comrades to join the fight. The majority were still terrified by the disaster they had just experienced, and Arbitio, believing that the result would be dangerous, was hesitating, when 3 tribunes leapt forward. Arinthius, acting commander of the heavy-armed guard, Synacus, who was in charge of a squadron of the household cavalry, and Bappo, an officer of the veterans. These, with the troops under them, making the common cause their own, like the Daci of old, fell on the enemy like a torrent, and put them to a disgraceful rout. It was not a pitched battle, but a succession of quick skirmishes. The ranks of the enemy were broken, and they were scattered. Finding their attempts to escape hindered by their armour, they cast it away, and exposed themselves unprotected to be cut down by a rain of blows from sword and lance. In many cases, man and horse lay dead on the ground together, with the rider apparently still fast on the back of his mount. At the sight of this, all those who were hesitating to join in the fight threw caution to the winds. Trampling on heaps of bodies, and drenched with the blood of the slain, they completed the destruction of the barbarian host, except for those who escaped death by flight. At this successful outcome of the battle, the emperor returned joyfully and triumphantly to pass the winter at Milan. Silvanus proclaimed Augustus and murdered. While things were in this disturbed state, the provinces suffered damage on a similar scale from a storm of fresh disasters. This would have caused universal and total ruin had not fortune, which governs the fates of men, put a rapid end to an exceptionally formidable uprising. Long neglect had exposed the provinces of Gaul to the miseries of slaughter, pillage, and fire. The barbarians plundered at will, and no help came, until at last the emperor sent his master of infantry, Silvanus, who was thought capable of redressing the situation. Arbitio used his best efforts to bring about this appointment. His aim was to impose on his absent rival, whose continued survival he resented, the burdens of a dangerous task. A man called Ammianus, superintendent of the imperial baggage train, in order to advertise his intimacy with Silvanus, had asked him for a letter of introduction for his friends. Silvanus, suspecting nothing, naively granted his request, but Ammianus kept the letters, intending in due course to put them to a mischievous use. So while the general in question was travelling through Gaul in the service of the state, and repelling the barbarians, who had now lost their confidence and courage, Ammianus, in whom restless activity went along with cunning and long practice in intrigue, devised an act of wicked fraud. According to an unconfirmed report, the Praetorian prefect Lampadius was his accomplice in this plot, together with Eusebius, formerly treasurer of the privy purse, who was nicknamed Glutton, and Aedesius, previously keeper of the records. These two had been invited to the investiture of the consuls at the insistence of the prefect, whose close friends they were. The lines of writing in the letter were obliterated by a sponge, leaving only the signature, over which a text quite different from the original was written. In this, Silvanus appeared to be indirectly begging his friends, both court officials and private individuals, among them were Tuscus Albinus and several others, to support him in his attempts to gain a higher position and in the near future the imperial throne. This bundle of fictitious documents, designed to destroy an innocent man, was placed by Ammianus in the hands of the prefect, and by him presented secretly in a private interview to the emperor, who was always eager to examine evidence of this kind, and with whom the prefect hoped to increase his influence by his unsleeping devotion to his master's safety. When this clever patchwork was read to the emperor's secret council, orders were given that the tribunes should be put under surveillance, and the private persons mentioned in the letters brought from the provinces. But Malaric, the commander of the Gentiles, shocked by the injustice of these proceedings, assembled his colleagues and protested loudly that it was wrong that men devoted to the imperial service should be sacrificed to the machinations of a cabal, he asked that he himself should be dispatched at once to fetch Silvanus, who was certainly not guilty of what was imputed to him by these ruthless conspirators. He would leave his relations as hostages, and Malobordes, the commander of the heavy brigade of guards, would give security for his return. Alternatively, he begged that he should be allowed to stand bail himself, while Malobordes hastened to Gaul to carry out the task which he himself had offered to undertake. He declared that he was quite sure that if an outsider was sent, Silvanus, who was temperamentally nervous even when there was nothing to alarm him, would be likely to disturb the peace. This suggestion met the needs of the situation, but Malaric might as well have spoken to the winds. Arbitio carried a proposal that Apodemius, the bitter and inveterate enemy of all good men, should be sent with a letter to fetch Silvanus. Apodemius cared so little what might happen that when he arrived in Gaul, he departed from his instructions. Instead of seeing Silvanus and presenting the letter of recall, he remained there, employing the local agent of the privy purse to ride roughshod over the dependents and slaves of the master of infantry, as if he were already outlawed and on the brink of execution. In the meantime, however, while people were waiting for Silvanus' arrival and Apodemius was disturbing the peace, Dynamius, in an attempt to add credibility to his monstrous forgery, composed a letter tallying with what he had sent to the emperor through the prefect, and sent it in the names of Silvanus and Malaric to the superintendent of the arsenal at Cremona. He was addressed as a fellow conspirator and told to get everything ready without delay. On reading this, the superintendent, not knowing what it meant, indeed he could not remember that the writers of the letter had ever held any confidential communication with him, sent the letter itself by the bearer who had brought it in charge of a soldier to Malaric, begging him to say what he wanted plainly and not in riddles. He was, he said, too unsophisticated and simple a person to understand obscure hints. When the letter suddenly came into the hands of Malaric, who was still in a state of deep depression, deploring his own fate and that of his fellow countryman Silvanus, he took a bolder line. He appealed to the Franks, of whom a large number at that time had influence in the palace, and raised a great clamour over the discovery of a conspiracy and the detection of a fraud manifestly aimed at their lives. At this the emperor decided that the matter should be thoroughly investigated by his council and the senior officers sitting together. When the court met, Florentius, son of Nigrinian, the acting master of the offices, found on careful examination of the documents traces of the original writing and discerned what was in fact the truth, that the earlier text had been tampered with, and something very different from what Silvanus had dictated had been written over it, with the design of producing a patchwork of lies. The cloud of intrigue was thus dissipated, and the emperor, receiving a faithful report of the facts, gave orders that the prefect should be dismissed from his post and brought to trial, but by the united efforts of a crowd of friends he was acquitted. Eusebius, however, the former treasurer of the privy purse, admitted under torture that he was a party to the plot. Odysseus, who persistently denied any knowledge whatsoever of the affair, got off unscathed. So the matter ended in the acquittal of all those against whom information had been laid. Dynamius, indeed, was treated as if he had highly distinguished himself, and was promoted to be governor of Etruria and Umbria with the title of Corrector. Meanwhile, Silvanus, who was at Cologne, heard by frequent reports from his friends of the efforts which Apodemius was making to undermine him. Knowing the sensitive disposition of the fickle emperor, and fearing that he might be destroyed in his absence without a trial, he found himself in great difficulty, and thought of throwing himself upon the mercy of the barbarians. He was prevented from doing so by Lanogaesius, at that time a tribune, who, as I have previously related, was the only person who stayed with Constans when he was dying. He was then serving as one of the emperor's personal guards. Lanogaesius warned Silvanus that his fellow countrymen the Franks would either kill him or take a bribe to betray him, so Silvanus, realizing that his present situation offered no hope of safety, was driven to adopt extreme measures. He became gradually bolder in his talk with his senior officers, and, when he had excited them by the promise of a great reward, he seized as a makeshift the purple which adorned the standards and banners of the troops, and assumed the imperial power. While this was happening in Gaul, there came to Milan at night an unexpected message, which left no doubt that Silvanus, aiming higher than the mastership of infantry, had seduced his army and been proclaimed Augustus. This unexpected blow struck Constantius like a thunderbolt. A council was called late at night, and all the dignitaries hastened to the palace. No one had the presence of mind or readiness of tongue to suggest what should be done, till at last people began to speak under their breath of Ursicinus as a man of outstanding military distinction who had been the innocent victim of grave injustice. He was accorded the unusual honour of being summoned by the master of ceremonies in person, and when he entered the council he was offered the purple to kiss much more graciously than ever before. Diocletian was the emperor who first introduced this foreign and kingly form of obeisance. Before him, we are told, the emperors were always greeted in the same way as holders of other high offices. So the man who a short time before had been accused by his ill-wishers of swallowing up the East and attempting to usurp the supreme power through his sons, now became the wisest of generals, the great comrade in arms of the Emperor Constantine, the only man to be looked to put out the fire, for reasons which were sound but nevertheless concealed an ulterior motive. Great efforts were certainly to be made to crush that stout rebel Silvanus, but if they failed, Ursicinus, into whose soul the iron had entered deeply, would be utterly destroyed, and a very formidable stumbling block thus removed. Accordingly, when preparations were being made to hasten Ursicinus' departure, and that general was eager to refute the charges against him, he was forestalled by the emperor, who said in mild tones that this was not the moment to embark on a defence which was bound to be controversial. On the contrary, the difficulties pressing upon them, which must be mitigated before they grew worse, made it urgently necessary that the parties should resume their former harmonious relations. A complicated discussion was held, in which the chief point debated was how Silvanus could be induced to think that the emperor was still in ignorance of what he had done. The best way of strengthening his confidence seemed to be to send a graciously worded letter telling him that Ursicinus was to relieve him, and that he should return in full enjoyment of his authority. When this was settled, Ursicinus received orders to set out. He was accompanied at his own request by some tribunes and 10 officers of the general staff to help in meeting the needs of the situation. Among the latter were my colleague, Verinian, and myself. All the rest were chosen by the emperor. Ursicinus set out with us in attendance, and for much of the way each of us was preoccupied solely by fear for his own safety. We were like condemned criminals thrown before wild beasts. Nevertheless, we reflected that there is this at least to be said for misfortune, that it can give place only to something better, and we dwelt with admiration on the sayings of Cicero, which seem to come from the very heart of the truth, and which run as follows: although the state most to be desired is the permanent continuance of undisturbed good fortune, nevertheless such a smooth course of life does not provide so piquant a sensation as a change to better things from misery and disaster. We proceeded therefore by forced marches, since our commander was anxious to appear in the suspected district before any rumour of the usurpation could spread through Italy. But for all our haste we were betrayed by common report, which flew before us on the wind, and when we reached Cologne we found a situation beyond our strength. A multitude had flocked in from all sides to support the enterprise so timidly begun, and in the face of this concentration of forces it seemed best that our general should change his tactics and accommodate himself to the intentions and wishes of the upstart emperor, whose confidence would be increased by these deceptive indications of an accession of strength. A pretext of falling in line with his wishes in various ways would make him relax his precautions and trick him into thinking that he had no enemy to fear. But to bring our project to a successful conclusion was no easy matter. It required nice calculation to ensure that our designs upon him ripened at the right moment, and were neither premature nor belated. If they came to light at the wrong time, we should all undoubtedly suffer a common sentence of death. Our general, however, was graciously received. The very nature of our business compelled him to incline his head, and he had to make a solemn obeisance to the man whose grasping ambition had led him to assume the purple, but he was treated as a distinguished and intimate friend. The ease with which he obtained access to Silvanus, and the high place assigned to him at the royal table, put him in so privileged a position that from that moment he was taken into confidential consultation on the most important matters. Silvanus was aggrieved because, while others had been advanced to the consulship and high dignities beyond their deserts, he and Ursicinus alone, after careers of great and continuous toil in the public service, had been treated with such contempt. The one, after being cruelly harassed by the judicial examination of his friends in a base dispute, had been summoned to be tried for treason, and the other had been brought back from the east and abandoned to the hatred of his enemies. This was his constant theme, both privately and in public. Such talk alarmed us, because it was accompanied by clamorous complaints from the troops all around. They bewailed their destitute condition, and were on fire to break through the passes of the Cottian Alps with the least possible delay. In this state of perplexity, we cast about in secret for a plan likely to effect our purpose, and at last, after many changes of mind from nervousness, we settled that we should use all our efforts to find discreet agents who could be sworn to secrecy, and who would work upon the minds of the Bracciati and Cornuti, troops whose loyalty was apt to waver, and who could be influenced in any direction by a handsome bribe. Some common soldiers, whose very obscurity made them suitable for our purpose, acted as intermediaries in the hope of a reward, and when the matter was arranged, a band of armed men sallied out just at dawn. They killed the guards, and, gaining confidence from this, as happens in moments of crisis, made their way into the palace, dragged Silvanus, who was on his way to a Christian service, from the shrine in which the panic-stricken man had taken refuge, and butchered him with repeated sword thrusts. Such was the end of a commander of no small merit, who was driven by fear of the slanders in which a hostile clique had ensnared him, in his absence, to adopt extreme measures in self-defence. He had a claim on the gratitude of Constantius for bringing his troops over to his side in the nick of time before the Battle of Mursa, and he could point also to the services of his father Bonitus, who, though a Frank, had often played a gallant part on Constantine's side in the civil war against the adherents of Licinius, but he feared Constantius' uncertain and fickle temper. A further circumstance is that before any of this happened in Gaul, the people in the Circus Maximus at Rome shouted aloud, "Silvanus is vanquished." Whether this was because of some report or from a premonition of the future is uncertain. The news that Silvanus, as I have related, had been killed at Cologne, was received by the emperor with unutterable joy. Confirmed in his arrogance and pride, he ascribed this too to his lucky star. Like Domitian before him, he always hated heroes, and tried to get the better of them by any sort of opposition. So far from praising Ursinius' adroit discharge of his mission, he even wrote that he had embezzled from the treasury in Gaul, which no one had touched. By way of investigating this, he ordered Remigatus, who at that time was in charge of finance at the headquarters of the commander-in-chief, to be narrowly questioned. This was the Remigatus who much later, in the reign of Valentinian, hanged himself because of the scandal of the mission from Tripolis. When this was over, Constantius was exalted to the skies, and adulated as the disposer of the fates of men in the extravagant language of his toadies, whose numbers he increased himself by the contempt with which he drove from him those unversed in this art. In the same way we read that Croesus drove Solon headlong from his kingdom because he did not know how to flatter, and Dionysus threatened the poet Philoxenus with death because when the tyrant was reciting his own absurd and clumsy verses, Philoxenus alone listened in silence, while the rest of the audience applauded. This pernicious custom is the nurse of vice. Praise should be welcomed to the ears of the great, only if an opening is also sometimes given to censure what has been done amiss. The execution of Silvanus' adherents. The restoration of control was followed by the usual trials, and many people suffered as criminals in chains and bondage. The hellish informer Paul came forward bubbling over with joy to exercise his poisonous arts with greater freedom, and when the council and officers met at the emperor's command to investigate the affair, Proculus, a member of Silvanus' household, was put on the rack. He was frail and ailing, and it was feared that the effect of cruel torture on his feeble frame would be to make him incriminate a heterogeneous crowd of people. In the event, however, quite the reverse happened. By his own account of the matter, he remembered a dream which forbade him to persecute an innocent man, and though he was tortured almost to death, he did not betray the name of a single person, but steadfastly maintained that Silvanus alone was responsible for an enterprise to which he had been driven not by ambition but by necessity. For this he produced powerful evidence, asserting convincingly that a number of people could testify that 4 days before he assumed the imperial insignia, Silvanus had made a payment to the troops in Constantius' name and exhorted them to be brave and loyal. It was clear that, if he had been contemplating at that time the assumption of a higher rank, he would have distributed so large a sum in his own name. After Proculus, Pominius suffered the fate of the condemned. He was dragged to execution and perished. Pominius, as I have previously related, had been chosen as the people's champion when Treveri closed its gates against the Caesar Decentius. In addition, the counts Asclepiodorus, Luto, and Maudio were put to death, together with a number of others, who fell victim to the inflexible and tortuous methods then in use in an investigation of this sort. Rome, Prefecture of Leontius, AD 355. In the midst of this storm of death and collective executions to which it gave rise, Leontius, the prefect of the Eternal City, gave many proofs of his excellence as a judge. He heard cases promptly and decided them impartially, and he was of a kindly nature, though some thought him severe and too much inclined to condemn in order to preserve his authority. The first incident that occasioned a demonstration against him was most trivial and insignificant. Orders had been given for the arrest of a charioteer called Philomarus, who was a particular pet of the mob. They followed him and launched a fearsome attack upon the prefect in the belief that he would be too timid to resist. Leontius, however, stood his ground. He set his constables upon the crowd, seized some persons and had them racked, and finally, without anyone daring to protest or oppose him, condemned them to exile on an island. A few days later, the mob rioted again with its habitual violence over an alleged shortage of wine, and collected at a much frequented spot called the Septum Zodium, where the Emperor Marcus had built a nymphaeum in a pretentious style. The prefect deliberately made his way to this place in spite of the earnest entreaties of his civil and military attendants not to expose himself to an insolent and threatening crowd, still seething from the excitement of the previous incident. He was a hard man to frighten and kept straight on, with the result that part of his escort abandoned him, although he was running into manifest danger, seated in his carriage apparently unmoved, and fixing his keen gaze on the gangs of rioters as if they were so many snakes. He had to endure a storm of abuse until finally he recognised a very tall red-headed man towering above the rest, and asked him if he had been rightly told that his name was Peter Valvomeres. When the man replied truculently that it was, Leontius, who already knew of him as the ringleader of the rioters, gave orders that he should be hoisted up to be flogged, with his hands tied behind him. There was a shout of protest, but when Peter was seen trussed up, his yells for help from his fellows proved vain. The whole mob, a moment before so tightly packed, scattered through the various quarters of the city, and vanished. And the worst of the troublemakers, having been flogged as quietly as if he were in a prison cell, was banished to Picenum. There at a later date he had the audacity to rape a girl of good family, and was sentenced to death by the governor, Patruinus. During Leontius' administration, Liberius, the Christian bishop, was summoned to appear before the imperial tribunal. His offence was resistance to the orders of the emperor and the decision of a majority of his brother bishops in a matter on which I will briefly touch. Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, who was persistently rumoured to have thoughts above his station, and to be prying into matters outside his province, had been deposed from his office by an assembly of the adherents of the same faith, meeting as what they called a synod. It was alleged that, being deeply versed in the interpretation of oracular sayings and of the flights of birds, he had on several occasions foretold future events. He was also charged with other practices inconsistent with the principles of the faith of which he was the guardian. Liberius shared the views of his brethren, but when he was ordered by the emperor to sign a decree removing Ammianus from his priestly office, he obstinately refused. He declared that it was entirely wrong to condemn a man unseen and unheard, and he openly defied the emperor's wishes. Constantius, who was always hostile to Ammianus, knew that the sentence had been carried out, but was extremely eager to have it confirmed by the higher authority of the Bishop of the Eternal City. Failing in this object, he just managed to have Liberius deported under cover of night. This was a matter of great difficulty because of the strong affection in which he was held by the public at large. Julian appointed Caesar. Events at Rome were as I have just related, but Constantius was disturbed by frequent messages about the desperate state of Gaul, which the barbarians were reducing to utter destruction unopposed. After long internal debate on how best to repel these troubles while he himself remained in Italy, which he wished to do because he thought it dangerous to remove to a distant region, he came at last to the right decision, and resolved to associate with himself in the imperial power his cousin Julian, whom he had recently sent for from Achaia, and who was still wearing his student's dress. While under the pressure of impending trouble, he communicated his decision to his closest associates, and declared openly, which he had never done before, that he could not sustain the burdens of such heavy and repeated crisis by himself any longer. They tried to turn his head by the flattery which they knew only too well how to apply, and maintained that there was no difficulty which his surpassing valour and the luck that raised him almost to the stars would not overcome, as it always had in the past. Several of them, who had a bad conscience about Julian, added that the title of Caesar should be avoided in future, and reminded Constantius of what had happened in the case of Gallus. Their persistent efforts encountered the solitary opposition of the empress, whether because she feared a journey to distant parts, or because her native sagacity led her to consult the interests of the state. She urged that preference should be given to a kinsman above any other. So after much bandying of the matter in inconclusive discussions, the emperor's decision stood. He dismissed further argument as pointless, and resolved to confer the imperial power upon Julian. Julian came when he was sent for, and on the appointed day the emperor took his place on a high platform, surrounded by eagles and standards, in the presence of all the troops that were available. Taking Julian by the right hand, he addressed the assembly in calm tones as follows. "We come before you, gallant guardians of the state, to plead a cause which is common to us all, but which needs little short of unanimous resolution to defend. Before submitting it to your impartial judgment, I will give a brief explanation. Since the death of the rebel usurpers, whose designs were inspired by rage and madness, the barbarians, as if to appease those unhallowed spirits with an offering of Roman blood, have disturbed the peace of our frontiers, and are ranging wantonly through Gaul, relying on the fact that harsh necessity requires our presence at the other end of the world. If while there is still time this mischief which is creeping forwards over adjacent territory is countered by steps which have your and our united support, the swelling pride of these people will subside, and the frontiers of the empire will remain unviolated. It is for you to strengthen by your approval the hope for the future which I am nursing. You see before you Julian, who is, as you know, our cousin, and who is endeared to us as much by his tried discretion as by the bonds of kinship, a young man moreover of conspicuously active temper. Him I desire to advance to the rank of Caesar, a proposal which needs to be ratified by your approval also, if you think fit." Constantius was about to continue when the assembled troops respectfully interrupted, proclaiming with a kind of prevision of the future that this was a revelation of the will of God rather than of any human mind. The emperor remained motionless until they were silent, and then resumed his speech with an increased confidence. "Your joyful acclamations show that I have your approval. Let then this young man, in whom strength is matched by composure, and whose sober conduct I ask you to imitate rather than to praise, come forward to receive an honour which can surprise no one. The excellence of his disposition, fostered by a good education, is fully attested by the fact that my choice has fallen upon him. Now, therefore, with the blessing of heaven, I will put upon him the imperial robe." With these words he clothed Julian in the purple of his ancestors, and declared him Caesar, to the joy of the troops. Then, when Julian stood before him dejected and wearing a slight frown, he addressed him thus: "Most beloved brother, you have attained while still young the distinction marked out for you by your ancestry, and this, I admit, increases my own glory, since to bestow power almost equal to my own upon a noble kinsman gives me a juster claim to be exalted than my power itself. Be then my partner in toil and danger, take upon yourself the government of Gaul, and bring relief to its afflicted regions by your generous treatment. If you have to meet the enemy in battle, post yourself firmly by the standards, watch for the right moment to encourage your men to an act of daring, keep up the spirit in the fight by taking the lead, though with circumspection. If they are in disorder, support them with reinforcements, calmly rebuke the slack, show yourself to heroes and cowards alike an impartial witness to their deeds. Go forth then in this hard time of trial to command men whose valour matches your own. We will help one another with undeviating mutual affection. We will wage war simultaneously, and if God grants our prayer, we will reign together equals in righteousness and mildness over a world at peace. I shall feel that you are with me everywhere, and in whatever you undertake I shall not fail you. In a word, go with all speed, taking with you our united prayers, to defend with unsleeping vigilance a post to which you have been appointed, so to speak, by the state in person." At this conclusion none could keep silent. All the troops clashed their shields against their knees with a fearsome din. This indicates complete approval, whereas to strike one's shield with one's spear is a sign of rage and grief. With few exceptions, they expressed prodigious joy at the choice of the Augustus, and evinced proper admiration for the Caesar, as he stood there blazing in the imperial purple, gazing long and earnestly at eyes at once delightful and awe-inspiring, and a face to which animation added charm. They tried to deduce what sort of man he would prove to be. It was as if they were examining those old books which interpret physical characteristics as a revelation of the spirit within. To preserve the respect owed to the higher rank of the emperor, their applause of Julian neither exceeded nor fell short of what was due. In fact, their sentiments were valued as expressions of critical judgment rather than soldierly enthusiasm. Finally, Julian took his seat with the emperor in his carriage, and was conveyed to the palace, whispering to himself this line from Homer: "Wrapped in death's purple by all-powerful fate." This took place on the 6th of November in the consulship of Arbitio and Lollianus. A few days later Caesar was united in marriage to Helena, the unmarried sister of Constantius, and on the 1st of December, when all arrangements needed for an early departure had been made, he set out with a small suite. He was escorted by the Augustus as far as a spot marked by 2 columns between Laumellum and Pavia, from which he marched straight to Turin. There he was shocked to receive bad news, which had reached the imperial court shortly before, but had been deliberately suppressed so as not to upset the preparations. It was that Cologne, the famous city of Lower Germany, had been taken by storm and destroyed by large forces of barbarians after an obstinate siege. This heavy blow went to Julian's heart. It seemed the first presage of disaster to come, and he was often to be heard complaining to himself that all he had achieved by his elevation was the prospect of perishing with more work on his hands. When he reached Vienna, people of all ages and classes ran to greet his arrival as an answer to their prayers. They believed in his lucky star, and when they caught sight of him in the distance, the whole population, reinforced from the country round about, went before him, chanting the praises of the gracious commander who would bring them prosperity. They gazed the more eagerly on his royal pomp, because he was a lawful prince. They saw in his arrival the remedy for all their troubles, and felt that a guardian angel had appeared to shed light on their lamentable situation. It was on this occasion that a blind old woman asked who had arrived, and being told that it was the Caesar Julian, cried out, "This is the man who will restore the temples of the gods." The origin of the Gauls. Now, since in the words of the sublime poet of Mantua, I am undertaking a grander task and a grander theme opens before me, this seems the right moment to describe the regions and the topography of Gaul. Otherwise, by mixing matters of which some readers are ignorant with my account of fierce engagements and the varying fortunes of war, I may seem like those careless sailors who are driven in the midst of a storm at sea to patch up the damaged sails and rigging which they might have put in order in a period of calm. Early writers, in discussing the origin of the Gauls, have left us with very imperfect knowledge, but at a later date, Timagenes, writing in his own tongue, with all the thoroughness of a Greek, put together long-forgotten information from a variety of books. I shall rely on his authority and set this out clearly and distinctly in a manner free from all obscurity. Some writers have maintained that the first people known in these parts were indigenous, and were called Celts after a much-loved king, and Galatia, the Greek name for Gauls, after his mother. Others assert that they were of Dorian origin and followed an older Hercules to settle in regions bordering on the sea. The Druids declare that part of the population was in fact indigenous, but was joined by newcomers from remote islands and the country beyond the Rhine, who had been driven from their homes by frequent wars and the encroachment of a stormy sea. Others say that after the sack of Troy, a few of those who were scattered everywhere in their flight from the Greeks occupied this region, which was then uninhabited. The inhabitants themselves strongly support a story which I have myself seen inscribed upon their monuments, that Hercules, the son of Amphitryon, made a hasty journey to destroy the cruel tyrants Geryon and Tariscus, who were oppressing Spain and Gaul respectively, and that when he had overcome them both, he formed unions with some women of good birth, by whom he had several children, who gave their own names to the territories which they ruled. In fact, however, a people of Asiatic origin left Phoenicia to escape the oppression of Harpalus, a satrap of King Cyrus, and came to Italy by sea. Some of them founded Velia in Lucania, others Marseille in the territory of Vienne, and in subsequent years, as their strength increased, a considerable number of other towns. I must, however, abstain from giving a variety of theories, since this is often cloying to the reader. With the advance of civilization in these parts, a taste for serious studies developed, encouraged by bards, seers, and druids. The bards recited the exploits of heroes in epic verse, accompanied by the sweet strains of the lyre. The seers turned their attention to the skies and endeavoured to explain the mysteries of nature, while the druids, who were of higher intellect, formed themselves into brotherhoods of the kind recommended by Pythagoras, rose above human concerns, which they despised, to the investigation of hidden and profound matters, and proclaimed the immortality of the soul. Of the Gallic Alps and the various passes through them. This country of Gaul, because of its lofty chains of mountains, always covered with formidable snows, was formerly all but unknown to the inhabitants of the rest of the globe, except where it borders on the coast, and bulwarks enclose it on every side, surrounding it naturally, as if by the art of man. Now, on the southern side, it is washed by the Tuscan and the Gallic Sea, where it looks up to the heavenly Wine. It is separated from the wild nations by the channels of the Rhine. Where it lies under the west-sloping sun, it is bounded by the ocean and the Pyrenees heights. And where it rises towards the east, it gives place to the bulk of the Cottian Alps. There King Cottius, after the subjugation of Gaul, lay hidden alone in their defiles, trusting to the pathless ruggedness of the region. Finally, when his disaffection was allayed, and he was admitted to the Emperor Octavian's friendship in lieu of a remarkable gift he built with great labour, shortcuts convenient to travellers, since they were midway between other ancient alpine passes, about which I shall tell later what I have learned. In these Cottian Alps, which begin at the town of Susa, there rises a lofty ridge, which scarcely anyone can cross without danger, for as one comes from Gaul it falls off with sheer incline, terrible to look upon because of overhanging cliffs on either side, especially in the season of spring, when the ice melts and the snows thaw under the warmer breath of the wind. Then over precipitous ravines on either side, and chasms rendered treacherous through the accumulation of ice, men and animals descending with hesitating step slide forward, and wagons as well, and the only expedient that has been devised to ward off destruction is this: they bind together a number of vehicles with heavy rope and hold them back from behind with powerful efforts of men or oxen at barely a snail's pace, and so they roll down a little more safely. And this, as we have said, happens in the spring of the year, but in winter the ground caked with ice, and as it were polished and therefore slippery, drives men headlong in their gait, and the spreading valleys in level places, made treacherous by ice, sometimes swallow up the traveller. Therefore, those that know the country well drive projecting wooden stakes along the safer spots in order that their line may guide the traveller safely. But if these are covered with snow and hidden, or are overturned by the streams running down from the mountain, the paths are difficult to traverse even with natives leading the way. But from the peak of this Italian slope a plateau extends for 7 miles, as far as the post named from Mars. From there on another loftier height, equally difficult to surmount, reaches to the peak of the Matrona, so called from an ancient accident to a noble lady. After that, a route steep to be sure, but easier to traverse, extends to the fortress of Ketone-Kun. The tomb of the prince who, as we said, built these roads is at Susa, next to the walls, and his shades are devoutly venerated for a double reason, because he had ruled his subjects with a just government, and when admitted to alliance with the Roman state, procured eternal peace for his nation. And although this road which I have described is the middle one, the shortcut, and the more frequented, yet there are also others, constructed long before at various times. Now the first of these, the Theban Hercules, when travelling leisurely to destroy Geryon and Teriscus, constructed near the maritime Alps, and gave the name Granian Alps, and in like manner he consecrated the castle and harbour of Monaco to his lasting memory. Then, later, after the passage of many centuries, the name Pennine was devised for these Alps for the following reason. Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the elder Africanus, when the Saguntines, famous both for their catastrophes and their loyalty, were besieged by the Africans with persistent obstinacy, wishing to help them, crossed to Spain with a fleet manned by a strong army. But as the city had been destroyed by a superior force, and he was unable to overtake Hannibal, who had crossed the Rhone 3 days before, and was hastening to the regions of Italy, by swift sailing he crossed the intervening space, which is not great, and watched at Genoa, a town of Liguria, for Hannibal's descent from the mountains, so that if chance should give him the opportunity he might fight with him in the plain, while exhausted by the roughness of the roads. At the same time, having an eye to the common welfare, he advised his brother, Gnaeus Scipio, to proceed to Spain and hold off Hasdrubal, who was planning to burst forth in like manner from that quarter. But Hannibal learned of this from deserters, and being of a nimble and crafty wit, came under the guidance of natives from among the Taurini, through the Tricassini and the extreme edge of the Voconti, to the passes of the Tricori. Starting out from there, he made another road, where it hitherto had been impassable. He hewed out a cliff, which rose to a vast height, by burning it with flames of immense power, and crumbling it by pouring on vinegar. Then he marched along the river Druentia, dangerous with its shifting eddies, and seized upon the district of Etruria. So much about the Alps. Let us now turn to the rest of the country. A brief discussion of the various parts of Gaul and of the course of the Rhone. In early times, when these regions lay in darkness as savage, they are thought to have been threefold, divided into Celts, the same as the Gauls, the Aquitanians, and the Belgians, differing in language, habits, and laws. Now the Gauls, who are the Celts, are separated from the Aquitanians by the Garonne River, which rises in the hills of the Pyrenees, and after running past many towns disappears in the ocean. But from the Belgians, this same nation is separated by the Marne and the Seine, rivers of identical sizes. They flow through the districts of Lyon, and after encircling in the manner of an island a stronghold of the Parisi, called Lutetia, they unite in one channel, and flowing on together pour into the sea, not far from Castra Constantia. Of all these nations, the Belgae had the reputation in the ancient writers of being the most valiant, and for that reason that being far removed from civilized life and not made effeminate by imported luxuries, they warred for a long time with the Germans across the Rhine. The Aquitanians, on the contrary, to whose coast, as being near at hand and peaceable, imported wares are conveyed, had their characters weakened to effeminacy and easily came under the sway of Rome. All the Gauls, ever since under the perpetual pressure of war, they yielded to the dictator Julius, have been governed by an administration divided into 4 parts. Of these, Gallia Narbonensis by itself comprised the districts of Vienne and Lyon. The second had control of all Aquitania. Upper and Lower Germany, as well as the Belgians, were governed by 2 administrations at the same time. But now the provinces over the whole extent of Gaul are reckoned as follows. The first province, beginning on the western front, is Lower, or Second Germany, fortified by the wealthy and populous cities of Cologne and Tongres. Next comes First or Upper Germany, where, beside other free towns, are Worms and Spires and Strasbourg, famous for the disaster of the savages. After these, the first province of Belgium displays Metz and Treves, splendid abodes of the emperors. Adjoining these are the second province of Belgium, in which are Amiens, a city eminent above the rest, and Chalons and Reims. In the same province we see Besancon and Auguste, more important than its many other towns. The first Lyonnese province is made famous by Lyon, Chalon-sur-Saône, Sens, Bourgogne, and Autun, with its huge ancient walls. As for the second Lyonnese province, Routon and Tours make it distinguished, as well as Evreux and Troyes. The Grayan and Pennine Alps, not counting towns of lesser note, have Avenchi, a city now abandoned, to be sure, but once of no slight importance, as is even yet evident from its half-ruined buildings. These are the goodly provinces and cities of Gaul. In Aquitania, which tends towards the Pyrenees mountains and that part of the ocean which extends towards Spain, the first province is Aquitania, which adorned by the greatness of its cities. Leaving out numerous others, Bordeaux and Clermont are conspicuous, as well as Santis and Poitiers. The 9 nations are ennobled by Orc and Bazas. In the Narbonnese province, Uzy, Narbonne, and Toulouse hold the primacy among the cities. The Viennese province rejoices in the distinction conferred by many cities, of which the most important are Vienna itself, Arles, and Valencia, and joined to these is Marseille, by whose alliance and power we read that Rome was several times supported in severe crisis. Near these are Aix-en Provence, Nice, Antibes, and the Îles de Hyères. And since we have reached these parts in the course of our work, it would be unfitting and absurd to say nothing of the Rhone, a river of the greatest celebrity, rising in the Pennine Alps from a prestigious store of springs. The Rhone flows in headlong course towards more level places. It hides its banks with its own stream and bursts into the lagoon called Lake Leman. This it flows through, nowhere mingling with the water outside, but gliding along the surface of the less active water on either hand. It seeks an outlet and forces a way for itself by its swift onset. From there, without any loss of volume, it flows through Savoy and the Seine province, and after going on for a long distance, it grazes the Viennese province on the left side and the Lyonnese on the right side. Next, after describing many meanders, it receives the Arar, which they call the Saucona, flowing between Upper Germany and the Seine province, and gives it its own name. This point is the beginning of Gaul, and from there they measure distances not in miles but in leagues. After this, the Rhone, enriched by the tributary waters of the Azur, carries very large craft which are frequently wont to be tossed by gales of wind, and having finished the bounds which nature has set for it, its foaming waters are mingled with the Gallic Sea through a broad bay, which they call Ad Gradus, at about the 18th milestone distant from Arles. Let this suffice for the topography of the region. I shall now describe the appearance and manners of its people. The character of the Gauls. Almost all Gauls are tall and fair-skinned, with reddish hair. Their savage eyes make them fearful objects. They are eager to quarrel, and excessively truculent. When in the course of a dispute any of them calls in his wife, a creature with gleaming eyes much stronger than her husband, they are more than a match for a whole group of foreigners, especially when the woman, with swollen neck and gnashing teeth, swings her great white arms, and begins to deliver a rain of punches mixed with kicks, like missiles, launched by the twisted strings of a catapult. The voices of most sound alarming and menacing, whether they are angry or the reverse, but all alike are clean and neat, and throughout the whole region, and especially in Aquitaine, you will hardly find a man or woman, however poor, who is dirty and in rags, as you would elsewhere. They are fit for service in war at any age. Old men embark upon a campaign with as much spirit as those in their prime. Their limbs are hardened by the cold and by incessant toil, and there is no danger that they are not ready to defy. No one here ever cuts off his thumb to escape military service, as happens in Italy, where they have a special name for such malingerers. As a race, they are given to drink, and are fond of a number of liquors that resemble wine. Some of the baser sort wander about aimlessly in a fuddled state of perpetual intoxication, a condition which Cato described as a kind of self-induced madness. There seems then to be some truth in what Cicero said in his defence of Fonteius, that henceforth the Gauls will take their drink with water, a practice which they used to think equivalent to taking poison. These regions, and especially those bordering on Italy, were gradually brought under the sway of the Romans without much effort. The first attempt upon them was made by Fulvius. After that their strength was impaired by Sextius in several minor battles. Finally, they were thoroughly tamed by Fabius Maximus, whose success in defeating the tough tribe of the Allobroges completed the business and earned him the name of Allobrogicus. The whole of Gaul, except, as Sallust tells us, for the inaccessible marshy districts, was subdued by Caesar after 10 years of fluctuating warfare, and attached to Rome by a treaty of perpetual alliance. I have allowed myself too long a digression, and I must now return to my main theme. Developments in the East. After the cruel death of Domitian, Musonian succeeded him as Praetorian Prefect in the government of the East. His command of both Greek and Latin won him a reputation which led to a career of unexpected distinction. Constantine, being in need of an interpreter in the course of his strict investigation into Manichaeism and similar heresies, had Musonian recommended to him as a suitable person, and appointed him to the post. His skilful discharge of this duty caused the emperor to change his name to Musonian. He was previously called Strategius, and from this beginning he rose through a number of career posts to the rank of prefect. He was a man of distinction whose rule the provinces found acceptable, and his manner was mild and urbane, but he seized any opportunity of gratifying a sordid love of gain, especially in judicial cases, where it is particularly disgraceful. This clearly manifested itself among other instances in the trials which followed the death of Theophilus, the governor of Syria, who was abandoned by the Caesar Gallus to be torn into pieces by a mob of rioters. A number of poor men who were known to have been elsewhere at the time of the incident were condemned, whereas the wealthy originators of this foul crime were able to buy themselves off by the loss of their property. Musonian was rivalled by Prosper, who was in command of the troops as deputy to the master of cavalry, who was still in Gaul. He was an arrant coward, who, as the comic poet says, thought it superfluous to employ art in his thievery, and plundered openly. These two were in league together, and enriched themselves by putting opportunities of profit in each other's way. Meanwhile, the Persian generals near the rivers, whose king was detained at the other end of the realm, kept our frontier in a state of turmoil by their predatory raids. They boldly invaded Armenia and on several occasions Mesopotamia, while the Roman commanders were engaged in despoiling their own subjects.